A powerful man, a routine stop. Yet nothing about this moment feels routine. When the flashing lights appear in his rear view, Governor James Caldwell realizes that authority doesn't always guarantee safety. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the quiet highway. Governor James Caldwell, a tall and charismatic black man in his early 40s, cruised down the open road in his sleek black sedan, savoring the rare peace after a town hall meeting. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his confidence radiated through every gesture. A man of power, a man of control. But control is a fragile illusion. The sudden wail of sirens shattered the calm, red and blue lights flooding his rear view. He frowned, signaling to pull over, confusion tightening his grip on the wheel. No speeding, no expired tags, nothing suspicious. And yet, unease slithered in. He knew too well how routine stops could spiral, especially for black men, even those who govern the state. The officer approached, his hand resting on his holstered gun, his gait slow but heavy with intent. "License and registration," he barked, his eyes scanning James with cold calculation. "The uniform may have authority, but does it have power?" Governor James Caldwell was about to find out. "What's a guy like you doing in a car like this?" The officer's words dripped with something far heavier than suspicion. James Caldwell, ever composed, lifted an eyebrow, his voice smooth yet firm. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" The cop's hand tightened on his holstered weapon. "Don't get smart with me. Step out of the vehicle." James exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about something uglier, something familiar. He opened his door and stepped out, his tall frame casting a shadow over the officer. He made no sudden movements, no gestures that could be misread. But then the words came, laced with venom. "Men like you don't belong in cars like that." James felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't flinch. He'd heard this before. He'd lived it. But this time, the officer wasn't just targeting any black man. He was targeting the governor. Officer R. Miller, his nameplate catching the fading sunlight, had no idea who he was dealing with. "Hands on the hood," he barked, relishing the power he thought he held. James hesitated, not out of fear, but strategy. Every movement mattered. He wasn't just a man on the roadside. He was a leader, a lawyer, a symbol. His voice remained steady. "Officer Miller, I'll cooperate. But am I being detained?" Miller's scowl deepened. "Don't start quoting the law to me. You think you're a big shot? Driving a car like this, wearing that fancy suit, probably stolen." James breathed in deeply, letting the insult hang between them. The officer didn't recognize him yet, and James wasn't about to reveal the truth just yet. He wanted Miller to keep digging his own grave. With deliberate ease, he pulled out his wallet, handing over his ID and registration. His state-issued identification gleamed in the sun, but Miller barely glanced at it before storming off to his cruiser, muttering under his breath. Leaning against his car, James watched. A few passing drivers slowed, their curious glances adding to the weight of the moment. Minutes dragged by. James saw it, the shift. The smugness on Miller's face faded as he stared at the license again, confusion creeping in. His radio crackled. He double-checked the ID, his brow furrowing. When Miller returned, irritation replaced arrogance. "You've got some nerve," he sneered. "Driving around like you own the place. Let me guess, someone gave you this car." James smiled faintly, calm despite the blatant disrespect. "Actually, I've had it for years. Hard work and dedication can do wonders, officer. You should try it sometime." Miller's eyes darkened. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing growl. "Watch yourself, boy. You're not as untouchable as you think you are." James almost laughed. If only Miller knew just how untouchable he really was. But this wasn't the moment to escalate. Not yet. Adjusting his jacket, he stood tall, unshaken. "Officer," he said evenly, "you have my license, my registration. So, are we done here?" Miller smirked, his hand still resting on his weapon. "We'll be done when I say we're done." His eyes narrowed. "What kind of work do you do to afford a car like this? Bet you're one of those guys who found a loophole. Or got lucky with a handout." James raised an eyebrow, resisting the urge to correct him. He wasn't lucky. He was qualified. And soon, Miller would realize just how big of a mistake he had made. The truth wasn't just a fact, it was a lesson. And Governor James Caldwell was going to make sure Officer Miller learned it the hard way. James studied Miller, his expression unreadable. There was no point in revealing his identity just yet, not when Miller was so determined to expose his own ignorance. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his tone almost amused. "Why don't you tell me what kind of work you think I do?" Miller scoffed, the arrogance in his stance thick as the heat in the air. "Drug dealer, maybe. Or one of those scam artists. I see it all the time, guys like you flashing cash they didn't earn." James held his ground, though his jaw tightened for just a moment. He'd heard it before. In boardrooms, in backrooms, from men who couldn't stand the idea that a black man could be more successful than them. The words were tired, predictable. "I see," James said, crossing his arms. "So, based on nothing but my appearance, you've already decided who I am and how I got here. That's an interesting perspective, Officer Miller." The sarcasm landed. Miller's expression darkened as he stepped even closer, deliberately invading James' space. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you?" he sneered. "Might want to tone it down before you end up in a jail cell tonight." For the first time, anger flickered beneath James' calm. This wasn't just a random traffic stop. This was about power. Control. Miller didn't know who James was, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. To him, James was just another black man. Another target. James exhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "Is that how you handle all your stops, officer? With baseless accusations and veiled threats?" Miller chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Like I said, you're not as untouchable as you think. Guys like you slip up eventually. And when you do, I'll be there." James saw it now, clear as day. The deeply ingrained prejudice, the desperate need to assert dominance. But what Miller still didn't see was the one crucial fact that would change everything. And James was about to show him. Power isn't just about who holds the badge, it's about who controls the moment. And Governor James Caldwell was about to take control. Miller was playing a dangerous game, but he was playing it blind. And James was about to show him just how badly outmatched he was. "Pop the trunk," Miller demanded, his voice sharp with impatience. "Let's see what you're hiding back there." James didn't move. His stance remained steady, his expression unreadable. "Do you have a warrant for that, officer?" Miller's face darkened, his frustration boiling over. "I don't need a warrant when I've got probable cause," he spat. "And you, standing here in your fancy suit, acting like you're better than me, that's cause enough." James let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. His lips curved into a faint smile, one that wasn't entirely friendly. "Interesting interpretation of the law," he mused. "But I'd suggest you tread carefully, officer. You might be closer to slipping up than you think." Miller sneered, mistaking James' warning for defiance. He had no idea that the balance of power was about to shift, and not in his favor. James remained calm as Miller escalated, his aggression growing by the second. The officer barked into his radio, calling for backup, determined to assert his authority. But by the time reinforcements arrived, the reality of the situation had already begun to unravel. As more officers pulled up, their expressions shifting from casual curiosity to sudden realization, the truth finally set in. James Caldwell wasn't just another man on the roadside. He was the governor. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Miller's actions, his unchecked prejudice, his abuse of power, were no longer just a personal disgrace. They were about to become a national conversation. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about justice, accountability, the responsibility of those who wore the badge to uphold the principles they swore to protect. And in that moment, James Caldwell stood not just as a governor, but as a man who refused to be diminished by another's prejudice. Miller had wanted to put James in his place. Instead, he had set the stage for a reckoning.